Hello, DESF friends. Um, Today I'm going to do a little demonstration about how to start building up an icon. We'll see how well this goes. Um, so let's just say that the phobia that you've chosen is the fear of blood. And let me see. Hey Siri, what phobia is the fear of blood? Let's see if we can ask her. Hey Siri, what phobia is the fear of blood? Okay, well, good, thank you. All right, so hematophobia. And let's just say I've done, a quick little thumbnail. Like I'm going to do, I don't know, here's like, and then maybe something knocked out here. And then like some blood. I don't know, maybe that's the hand. Well, let's just say you want the thumb up here. Just a general idea, like of a hand. Maybe there's some blood. And so that's your quick thumbnail. It's not very good, but gets the idea across. Something to do with blood here. And so let's just say we'll make a new layer for that. All right, so that's your little thumbnail that you did. Not the best, but it just gives this idea across. It's like I want to talk about blood. Okay, so I have yoinked this. Okay, let me move that. Make it a little smaller. Get out of the way. I have yoinked this grid from blog.fontawesome.com. One of the examples that I used in the pseudo lecture that I posted earlier today. Now, I talked a little bit in that lecture about grids and what they're for, but basically it's a visual way of organizing your visual elements, well, organizing your visual elements in such a way that it gives you constraints or rules to follow. Um, Now, some considerations here. First of all, I'm using this grid. I'm not meaning that to be prescriptive in the sense that you have to use this grid too. Uh, for example, you may find that you want your grid to also include, let's just say, smaller size here. Let's change this to red just for the sake of like, let's say you want your grid to have 45-degree diagonal lines. So your grid, could have little crisscrossy lines across this. And maybe you want them to go in the other direction too. They could. It all depends on what sort of a system you want to set up for yourself, what kind of rules. But I'm using this one as an example just because, to save time and not have to build an entire system for myself from scratch. But a good place to start would be just simply a rectangular grid that helps you begin to think about, okay, constrained at least in this way by a certain number of grid blocks this way, a certain number of grid blocks this way, uh, left to right, top to bottom. That now I have the beginnings of a way of thinking about, okay, how do I create this shape, this object that this little thumbnail sketch. Um, I keep on wanting to fix it, but don't worry about that too much. I want to start thinking about that on this shape or these shapes and how they might work out in a grid system. Now, what's nice about this is as you go, especially if this is like maybe the first thumbnail that you've selected and that you're working on, um, you can begin with a basic grid and begin as you go. You might find out that you need, let's just say, a lot of shapes as you rough this out, a lot of shapes that maybe are rectilinear on one end and too much. Rectilinear on one end and fill these grid blocks about too wide, but then on the other end, you need it to be like a half circle there. Like, see this finger here. You want things to look like this finger. So you're starting to establish a little bit of a rule by saying, okay, uh, we've got a kind of a line shape here. Sometimes if you make a line thick enough, it becomes a shape. Same thing with a point. There's a point, but then if it starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it starts to turn into a circle. That's just an aside. But let's just say I start to come out with this rule. So I know at the very least I'm going to need, things that go at right angles and then some full circle shapes. Then the grid can start to reflect that. Like I know they put this little corner here to indicate that nothing can ever go past this corner. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't. Maybe your grid can actually just come to a point there. But you start to come up with little constraints as you go and figure out that you need this and you don't need that, or if you almost never, come across like a weird squiggly shape like this, then you know that okay, well, I have no use for that, and so it doesn't need to be a part of my system. Um, your system can develop, your grid system can develop as you go, as you start to develop out some of your ideas. Um, Also, but it's good not to have it too open because, a grid with too many or too few limitations isn't really a grid at all. It's just it might as well not be there if anything goes. So you do want to start as you go, starting to figure out, that you have definite constraints to follow. Um, they have these what are called key shapes. Now, in the grid that they've set up, they've made a system of visual unity wherein if you have, see, I'll hide this, make another layer. If you have a circle, terrible circle, but if you have a circle shape, and let's zoom out a little bit, down there just to get it out of the way. A horizontally wide rectangle shape. Oh, I'm a little embarrassed because they've actually diagrammed all of that right here. Each of these key shapes corresponds to, increase the opacity so you can see it, one of these key shapes. in other words, a general idea of like, if you need a square, then the square should be this dimension. If you need a circle, it should be this dimension, which you may notice the circle extends beyond the square just a little bit in each direction. And I'll talk about this in a second. If you need a rectangle, then it goes in a little bit, in a little bit, out a little bit, and it can have the same height, or if it's a horizontal one, it can have the same width, but it compensates by reducing in dimension in either the horizontal or the vertical direction. The reason for this is so that each of these basic, kind of core shapes have an equal visual weight to them. The idea is that at least perceptually, they occupy kind of the same area in space, so that you don't have one icon that looks heavier than another icon, which could happen if, for instance, your square were just a little wider to where it matches the exact height and width of the circle. Now you may notice that this square looks a little heavier than this, so you want to avoid that. Anyway, that's just the rationale of why they have um, in their grid this circle, square, tall rectangle, wide rectangle. So let me take the opacity back there. We'll start talking about that. So you may notice that this thumbnail uh, has more of a wide profile than a tall one. So I might begin, by looking at the constraint of this um, wider rectangle within this grid. Um, so let's give that a shot and see kind of where it takes us. So if the thumb here is, you've got kind of 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course we have 5 fingers, so 5 little sausage shapes. Let's see if we can divide that up along, and keep it within this grid and see how that works. So I'm going to hold down my shift key, make this a little easier. Just fill that up. And why not? We'll just go ahead and fill this in. All right, it fits nicely within that grid anyway. So let's see what happens if let's see, how many grid squares are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Huh, okay. 5 fingers. I don't know. Let's just knock one of those out. I'm not good at math, so let's see what happens if we go one grid space. Yeah, it's not quite working, is it? 2, and then we've got a third one up here. Although the thumb is bigger, you might think about it that way. You're still free to play around and experiment with different things to see if this works. Um, so maybe what we do, we just grab all this. What happens if we pull this here and just move it up a grid square and see how that looks? Because what we could do is have the thumb overlapping the index finger. Wonder what that would do, because you're possible. I don't know, just real fast. Let's take this out to the deselect. Take this all the way out to here. Oops. Again, we're just kind of experimenting, playing with some shapes. See what might work. Well, we're getting into some interesting ideas here. Do I want that to end like that? Maybe, maybe I do. Ah, what do you know? Okay, we've got a little bit of a hand there. Now, do I want to maybe, let's say, curve this in just to kind of make this match? I don't know. If I do, I'm kind of creating a little bit of a new rule here, right? Because so far I've got right angles, all right angles, and only these kind of line shapes terminate in a round shape. But there's this kind of aesthetically pleasing way of rounding that corner. I'm going to leave it for now. I'm going to just say, like, maybe that's a rule I can break. Or maybe a new rule is just, if a corner mirror or approaches one of these rounded terminals, then you can round it off like that. Um, let's think about the blood drop. So this thing is about, if you look at my thumbnail, that blood drop takes up a pretty decent takes up a pretty decent size. So I wonder how much grid space do we have here? So we got 1, 2. If we make it 3 wide and we bring it all the way up here, that creates an interesting, or 4 wide, excuse me. How big should, so you can see that like a blood drop, maybe the bottom half of it is this kind of round circle. So let's see how big should that circle be. If it's a 4 grid unit circle, whoa, that's a lot of blood. Now, you might be thinking like skeuomorphically, oh gosh, that's a lot of blood. Um, do I want it to be that big? Well, maybe, maybe not. One question might be, does it still read at a distant size? So one consideration you want to take into consideration with your icons is that design elements that are too small or too skinny begin to get lost when you reduce your icon in size. Uh, most images, can look good at a large size. Like let's just say, just as an example, this little mistake I made. If that were an integral part of the design, it wouldn't really work well for this icon. See this tiny little nub here. Um, because when I start to zoom out, it disappears practically. It's very barely noticeable at all, if it's even there. We're looking at a retina screen, so this thing is probably holding together a little bit better than it would in a lot of contexts. But you want to make sure that your design elements um, are have enough difference in size so as to provide contrast, but that they are not so far apart, or that there is not such a huge difference in size where you have tiny little elements that disappear when your final icon would be reduced. And also, what you're saying about or what I was saying about the blood drop. Is it too big? Well, Does it read as a blood drop from far away? It's certainly noticeable. It's got enough size to be seen at a small distance, but I'm seeing a few issues, one of which is the proximity. Even though it's one grid block away, it's not reading as a separate kind of a unit, as a blood drop that's coming out of this finger. It's kind of reading as like maybe part of the greater whole. You do want to at least indicate with this icon that there's two things, a hand and then the blood drop, not some strange combination of shapes that reads as a single unit. So let's see, how can we fix that? Let's experiment a little bit. Grab this and maybe move it over a unit. So we're not really breaking the integrity of, if this is a 4 grid block wide circular shape with a triangle on top, it's reading as a blood drop shape, I think. And we've got two, well, let me see, a little bit less than. Yeah, two grid blocks now in between the right side of the blood drop and the hand shape. Um, let's zoom back out. Yeah, it's reading now a little bit more like a separate piece, but that's still a pretty huge blood drop. I do wonder if it could read still as well if it were only 3 grid blocks wide. One, two, three. Yeah, just checking. Oh, okay. Now it's even further separated from the hand, and it's a decent sized block or blob or drop of blood. So it really does place emphasis on this, or on the idea that this is, a drop of blood that's coming out of this hand. It exaggerates a little bit. The other thing that it provides is contrast in several areas. So by not reaching to the bottom of the same grid unit that the hand is, it indicates its separation from the hand as a different thing. Also created by this separation of 3 grid blocks away, which is a unique distance because so far we've only been dealing with ones and twos. Each finger is about 2 blocks wide. Well, other than the palm of the hand here is 3, but 1 block in between. So we're setting up a kind of a contrast situation where you have this blood drop clearly showing that it's of a different character than the rest of these shapes. Um, let me see. So clean that up a little bit. Now we're starting to come up with some new rules as I build this. It's like, oh, now obviously these types of angles perhaps maybe should be legal. And if we because if you set up that as an idea earlier, like, uh-oh, I had only said, let's just say that my grids could have 45-degree angles in them. Well, here's something that's not 45 degrees. Can we still do that if that were a constraint that we had set up previously? Let's give it a shot. Maybe. I don't know. That could work. Kind of have a 45-degree angle here. Consider also that if this is 3 grid blocks wide, this is bisecting the middle grid block. Um, you may have a rule in place, or maybe you want to set up a rule that, I don't know, 4 points or other kinds of things, they can bisect grid blocks if the main unit of if the main shape is 3 wide. Um, so you can see how as we're going, we're kind of figuring out, do we have certain rules? Can they be broken or can they be made into new rules? Let's just see from a distance. Does this still read? Maybe, but I like the contrast of that previous shape and how kind of long and pointy that is and how much it separates it out from the rest of the shapes. That it increases not just contrast um, of size or a different type of a shape, but also, right now everything is right or right angles. So this angle that's like looks like 30, 60, 90 um, is a stronger contrast to the rest of these, which sets up drop of blood. And if we wanted to even make the imagery stronger, we could add that cute little highlight, maybe right in the spot where a grid block would be, a circular one. Do we want it to make it only one grid block? Is that a rule we can have? Or maybe it's a kind of a line that mimics this angle with a circle on each end. Zoom out and see. I don't know. Maybe the circle's enough. What if it's a bigger circle? What if it's too wide? If it's a 3, kind of have that half grid block problem again, because if you make this transparent, you can see that that clear dot is kind of bisected by this grid line. So once again, maybe our half grid block um, increments allowable? It's up to you. Um, just remember that if you break too many rules and make a grid too open, then it starts to lose unity from shape to shape, because you may have a number of rules that you're following in this grid, but if you move to the next icon and the rule set is just too loose, you might have it following some rules from this one and not following other rules from this one, and it doesn't look like they belong in the same family anymore. And as we were talking about earlier, maybe skeuomorphism, like we're straying into skeuomorphism, like things looking like things when you're dealing with shapes that have highlights. So maybe we don't want that. I don't know. But then you might be thinking, oh, well, how do we know then that this is blood, right? Maybe symbolically, this is you've dipped your finger in the waters of a magic well, and this is, just a drop of water hanging off the tip of your finger. How do you know that it's blood? That's a good uh, question. A symbolic cue that can be seen in, let me see, I'm going to look this up real quick. Mower safety icon. See if I can find this classic. Ah, well, it's not from a lawnmower, but we've seen icons like this before, and it's pretty clear what's happening. This hand is in danger. This symbolic hand here is in danger of being severed by something triangular. Remember our shape language, that's very sharp. And it's actually taking a chunk out of the hand here. So we can do something like that. So if we want to blood, something that issues forth from a cut. Now let's see, if I just kind of start nicking out, oops, triangle shape, yeah, that kind of does it, but it's kind of weird. It's a little strange that it kind of interrupts this circular shape of the tip of the finger. What if we instead moved this droplet back here? So now we no longer have the tip of the drop breaking the grid lines, but you do have the edges of these of the circular part of this drop violating, not violating, but like bisecting these grid blocks. Maybe we could still adjust that. So let's just see. What if this circle got a little bigger, this angle was a little more severe to where, oh, now we're back to 1, 2, 3, 4 grid blocks again. See how well that worked out? And let's see, if we nick out this triangle shape here, what if we take it all the way up to the half, or up to that grid block line? You've got a nice unity here, one grid block, and you're mimicking the angle of this droplet. Does that read from a distance? Yeah. And maybe if you work at this solution longer, you can come up with, uh, you know, with more time, who's to say you could come up with a more elegant solution than this one. But this is not, necessarily an example of an excellent icon design, but more just to kind of show the process of how you can get going with this. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in class.